Hi everyone, welcome back to English 229. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 23rd, where I wanted to put some closure onto Lovecraft and begin The Haunting of Hill House. As you know, I had some technological issues last class. Thank you for your patience. I was able to resolve them. And I did post a video from a previous class talking a little bit about H.P. Lovecraft, but I thought I'd talk about some quotations today and remind you that there's an extension for the H.P. Lovecraft Journal, and that will now be due on the 28th, which is the Monday after Thanksgiving, 11:59 p.m. via PDF to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu. And we will make adjustments accordingly for the journals that follow as well. So, in terms of Lovecraft, as you know, he was a great admirer of Edgar Allan Poe, and I think that you could see in just the 3 stories that I had assigned about Lovecraft that he definitely tries to emulate many of Poe's techniques, trying to give this sense of atmosphere using an I narrator, for instance, which we saw with The Outsider, one of my favorite stories, because it really emphasizes this idea of other and difference and who or what is monstrosity. So a theme that we've talked about all semester long. And if you wanted to think about some of the specific language in the second paragraph of the first page of The Outsider, for me, this would be on page 27 of my text. I know not where I was born, save that the castle was infinitely old and infinitely horrible, full of dark passages and having high ceilings, where the eye could find only cobwebs and shadows. The stones in the crumbling corridor seemed always hideously damp, and there was an accursed smell everywhere, as of the piled-up corpses of dead generations. It was never light, so that I used sometimes to light candles and gaze steadily at them for relief. Nor was there any sun outside, since the terrible trees grew high above the topmost accessible tower. There was one black tower which reached above the trees into the unknown outer sky, but that was partly ruined and could not be ascended save by a well-nigh impossible climb up the sheer wall, stone by stone. So, of course, the twist is that this isn't a castle. This happens to be a crypt. Our narrator is dead, but yet still has self-consciousness. And one of the things that I personally don't care for with Lovecraft is his need to italicize the twist ending. We know that Poe was very well known for twist endings as well. But just to ensure that we don't miss the twist. And this would be on page 32 of The Outsider, in the version that I'm using, where it says, "This I have known ever since I stretched out my fingers to the abomination within the great gilded frame, stretched out my fingers and touched a cold and unyielding surface of polished glass." In other words, he sees an image of himself, which gets to the idea of doubling and doppelganger that we've also discussed over the course of this semester. And when he talks about this unclean, uncanny, unwelcome, abnormal, and detestable being, of course, it's not easy to describe the monstrosity. He tries. He oftentimes talks about green ichor, which we will discuss when we talk about the Dunwich Horror. I don't know how possible it is to really describe monstrosity, but when we move to something like Pickman's Model, one of the reasons why I selected this particular story is, again, similarities with Poe. We've got an I narrator that is basically indicating that, no, I'm not crazy. And, of course, we know with Poe that means that the narrator is crazy. In this instance, the narrator is truly sane. But there is this long tradition of linking art with the supernatural, and that's something that we definitely see in Pickman's Model. If we had time, we could have read the picture of Dorian Gray, but Lovecraft is very good at building dramatic tension, I believe. I'll say that. And when he gives us some of the descriptions of the horrific pictures that Pickman is portraying, I don't know if it's possible to give us a true sense of monstrosity. For me, this is on page 42 where he says, "And it was the technique, Eliot, the cursed, the unnatural technique I never saw elsewhere, the actual breath of life so fused into a canvas. The monster was there. It glared and gnawed and gnawed and glared. I knew that only a suspension of nature's laws could ever let a man paint a thing like that without a model, without some glimpse of the netherworld, which no mortal unsold to the fiend ever had. And of course, our twist ending, last sentence. But by God, Eliot, it was a photograph from life. That the models that Pickman happens to be drawing aren't from his imagination. That he actually has access into the netherworld and he's able to paint from real life. And then when we get to the Dunwich Horror, I wanted that piece, which is a longer story, because it helped to establish the idea of Cthulhu, which is very famous in terms of Lovecraftian folklore. Cthulhu, a great monstrosity that in theory can't even be pronounced. So the best or the closest we can come to with our human tongues is Cthulhu. And he's built a whole mythology. So if you happen to be a Lovecraft fan, he's created a world, much like Tolkien has created a world, with a Miskatonic university at the center of it that is oftentimes viewed as a kind of placeholder for something like a Harvard. And of course, one of the fun things about Lovecraft, if you're a New Englander, are all of his references to local areas. And the Dunwich Horror begins with, on page 98 of my version, when a traveler in north central Massachusetts takes the wrong fork at the junction. And then he goes on, of course. In fact, even in one of his stories that I didn't assign, he even makes reference to Greenfield, Massachusetts. So Dunwich, or outsiders visit Dunwich as seldom as possible. And talked a little bit about some of the strangeness that's occurred in Dunwich. One of the things that Lovecraft likes to do is foreshadow and give us a good number of clues so that we can put things together. We find out that in Candlemas was a time when these horrific noises were heard. That happens to be February 2nd, Candlemas. It's the main festival for witches. Again, Lovecraft is well aware of his supernatural folklore. And unlike some of the other texts that we've read over the course of the semester that's given us ambiguity, we don't have that ambiguity with Lovecraft. The monstrosity does indeed exist. And we think that Wilbur Whately is the monster, but we find out that there is a much bigger monstrosity. Again, I don't know how possible it is to describe monstrosity. But for me, on page 104, we're told a little bit about he was exceedingly ugly, despite his appearance of brilliancy. There being something almost goatish or animalistic about his thick lips, large pored yellowish skin, coarse crinkly hair, oddly elongated ears. And then, of course, as the piece continues, and there are references to important pagan days such as May Eve and All Hallows Eve, right before that, on page 106, there's a passage that I wanted to read. In 1917, the war came, and the Squire Sawyer Whately, a chairman of the local draft board, had hard work finding a quota of young Dunwich men fit even to be sent to development camp. The government, alarmed at such a sign of wholesale regional decadence, sent several officers and medical experts to investigate, conducting a survey which New England newspaper readers may still recall. It was the publicity attending this investigation which set reporters on the track of the Whateleys and caused the Boston Globe and the Arkham Advertiser to print flamboyant Sunday stories of young Wilbur's precociousness and old Whately's black magic. And Lovecraft is very good with mixing reality, like the Boston Globe, with his fictional universe, the Arkham Advertiser, to give us a sense of authenticity. In fact, the Necronomicon, that book that is housed in Miskatonic University, but also is housed in other places, that is filled with magic spells that's referenced in the Dunwich Horror and many other Lovecraftian stories. There's even been folklore associated that the Necronomicon is actually a real book because Lovecraft has done such a nice job of detailing it so that it seems like it's part of reality. And then, of course, We learn a little bit about ancient evil, and on May Eve, which is May Day, which is a rite of fertility, this is where we find out that Wilbur, who was born on Candlemas 9 months after the May Eve celebration of 1912, where there were queer earth noises that reached to Arkham. Again, we can put all of these pieces together, and another attempt at a description of monstrosity. At this point, Wilbur is dead, and this is on page 114. The thing that lay half bent on its side in a pool of greenish-yellow ichor, there's that ichor I was referencing, and tarry stickiness was almost 9 feet tall. The dog had torn off all the clothing and some of the skin. It was not quite dead, but twitched silently, spasmodically, while its chest heaved in monstrous union with mad piping of the expectant whippoorwills outside. And there's lots of folklore associated with whippoorwills. They're supposed to be harbingers of upcoming death. Keep that in mind, because whippoorwills will be mentioned in future texts this semester. Above the waist, it was semi-anthropomorphic, though its chest, where the dog's paws had rested watchfully, had the leathery hide of a crocodile or alligator. The back was piebald with yellow and black, dimly suggested the squamous covering of certain snakes. Below the waist, though, it was the worst, for here all the human resemblance left off, and sheer fantasy began. The skin was thickly covered with coarse black fur, and from the abdomen a score of long greenish-gray tentacles with red sucking mouths protruded. On each hip, deep set in a kind of pinkish orbit, was what seemed to be a rudimentary eye, while in lieu of a tail there depended a kind of trunk or feeler with purple annular markings, many evidences of being an undeveloped mouth or throat. The limbs, save for their black fur, roughly resembled the hind legs of prehistoric Earth's giant saurians, and terminated in ridgy veined pads that were neither hooves nor claws. And when the thing breathed, its tail and tentacles rhythmically changed color. And again, what we see is Lovecraft trying to reach the level of sophistication of someone like an Edgar Allan Poe. I don't know if he necessarily was able to do that, but he definitely has created a mythology that lives on with his world of Cthulhu. And if nothing else, he also is responsible for some of the best scholarship that is available for Gothic literature, since we began the semester with his essay, Supernatural Horror and Literature. And the Dunwich Horror ends where we're told it was mostly a kind of force that doesn't belong in our part of space, a kind of force that acts and grows and shapes itself by other laws than those of our nature. We have no business calling in things from the outside, and only very wicked people and very wicked cults ever try to do so. There is some of it in Wilbur Whately himself, enough to make a devil and a precocious monster of him, to make his passing out a pretty terrible sight. I'm going to burn his accursed diary. If you men are wise, you'll dynamite that altar stone up there, pull down all the rings of standing stones on the other hills. Things like that brought down the beings those Whateleys were so fond of, the beings they were going to let in tangibly to wipe out the human race and drag the earth off to some nameless place for some nameless purpose. But as to this thing we just sent back, the Whateleys raised it for a terrible part in the doings that were to come. It grew fast and big, from the same reason that Wilbur grew fast and big, but it beat him because it had a greater share of outsidedness to it. You needn't ask how Wilbur called it out in the air. He didn't call it out. And then, of course, in the italics, it was his twin brother, but it looked more like his father than he did. Again, that idea of doubling. But I wanted to move to The Haunting of Hill House and talk a little bit about Shirley Jackson from Vermont, so local. She claimed to be a practicing witch and that she had more than 500 books of the occult in her own personal library. Keep in mind, these are the pre-internet dates. What I think is quite fascinating about Shirley Jackson is that we have a female author, something we haven't seen since Frankenstein, but we also have a female lead, something that we haven't seen at all thus far. And we see an examination of psychological instability and the possibility of supernatural, but it could also be paranormal. And we'll talk about the distinction of the two as we continue to talk about the text. Jackson's been called a master of suggestion. The ghost story, particularly the English ghost story, is known to be quite subtle. You'll remember The Monkey's Paw, which you listened to for Halloween. And while Jackson isn't necessarily British, she was quite aware of the English ghost story and utilized many of its forms in her own ghost story, The Haunting of Hill House. And probably the most well-known version of The Haunting of Hill House is the 1963 filming of The Haunting. I know that there was a remake that was done. I believe it was in the 2000s. And the special effects are phenomenal, but I don't think that it really captures the essence of the characterization, which I think is the strength of the novel and Shirley Jackson's novel. I've also heard from former students that The Haunting is now a television series. And as always, they've taken liberties as necessary. But this particular version of The Haunting of Hill House was directed by Robert Wise, who was also the director of West Side Story at the time. And the film was a critical success, unusual for horror films at the time, but not necessarily a box office success. Some speculation is that perhaps it was because it was shot in black and white, which helps to establish mood. But by that point, audiences were really wanting and expecting color. And as always, you can expect some changes in the text. But I'm well aware that we are on the cusp of Thanksgiving, so what I thought what we would do for this class and our class after Thanksgiving is watch The Haunting. It is a long movie. It can be divided up into two pieces. So what I recommend is that you watch up to minute 55:36. That's a natural break point for this class. And then on Monday, as I will post, that you could start up at that point and then finish the movie in its entirety. And on Monday, I'll have an attendance question for you, as I usually do. But this is Wednesday before Thanksgiving. So there is no attendance question. Have a happy Thanksgiving. Eat, drink, and be merry. And we'll continue on Monday. Take care. Bye-bye.